"I need space from this marriage," she said with eyes that no longer carried the warmth I once knew, her hands swiftly folding my shirts into a suitcase as though I were a guest overstaying my welcome. I stood frozen, watching the woman I had promised forever to carefully prepare my exit, as if my presence had become an intrusion in her carefully curated life. I could have begged, argued, or even tried to reason with her, but instead I heard myself reply with a calm finality I hadn't rehearsed. "Take all the space you want. Forever." Those words would change the trajectory of my life, and though at that moment I didn't fully understand the weight of what I was saying, I knew deep down that I was crossing a line I could never return from. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Adrian, and for most of my 37 years I believed in steady, enduring love. I wasn't flashy, I wasn't the kind of man who sought chaos or drama. I valued stability, routine, and the comfort of knowing where I stood in life. For years, I believed I had exactly that with my wife, Lila. We met in a way that almost felt scripted for a romantic film, at a small coastal bookshop in Astoria, Oregon, where the scent of salt water mingled with old paperbacks and the soft hum of tourists browsing shelves. She was browsing travel guides for Spain, a country she said she had always dreamed of exploring, while I was standing in the aisle pretending to decide between two novels I'd already read. She glanced up at me with this spark in her eyes, and it wasn't just her beauty. It was the way she seemed alive, untamed, curious about everything. I was instantly drawn in, and from that moment, my world was colored differently because she was in it. In the beginning, our story was everything a man like me could hope for. She brought vibrancy into my steady life, and I brought her a sense of grounding she said she always lacked. Lila had grown up in a family that moved constantly, chasing job opportunities and fleeing from financial instability. I, on the other hand, was born and raised in one town, with parents who still lived in the same house they'd built when they were married. Our differences felt like pieces of a puzzle that somehow locked together perfectly. She made me try things I never would have considered: salsa dancing classes, spontaneous road trips, cooking meals from different cultures with ingredients I couldn't even pronounce at first. I, in turn, gave her consistency and the security she admitted she had always craved. When we got married, it felt natural, as though we were simply putting a seal on what we already knew to be true, that we were partners not just for a moment, but for the long haul. I remember standing under the arch we built with our own hands in a friend's backyard, promising her not just love, but understanding, patience, and devotion. She laughed through her vows, voice quivering but eyes shining, and I thought, this is it, this is my forever. But standing in that bedroom years later, with my clothes being tucked into a suitcase I didn't ask for, I couldn't reconcile how we had traveled from those sacred vows to this moment of detachment. She was the one saying she needed space, yet it was her hands pushing me out the door, as if she were already halfway gone long before she ever spoke the words. That day, my mind couldn't stop circling back to the image of her in that bookstore, laughing about how the Spanish phrasebook made no sense to her. That version of her felt galaxies away from the woman now carefully smoothing out the wrinkles on my shirts, almost obsessively neat, as though she couldn't wait to erase any trace of me from our shared drawers and closet. My heart, once so sure of us, stumbled over the contradiction of who she had been and who she had become. Still, a part of me needs to explain, needs to tell you how it all began before the cracks appeared, because if you don't know the sweetness of the beginning, the bitterness of the ending doesn't make sense. You need to understand how I went from being the man she adored to the man she dismissed, not because it absolves me of blame, but because stories of love turning into silence rarely happen overnight. They are slow burns, almost invisible at first, until one day you realize the house is ash and smoke. I wasn't always the man who stood silent while my marriage slipped away. Once, I was the man who believed that if you gave enough love, it would fill in all the gaps, that if you poured yourself into the foundation, the walls would hold no matter the storm. In those early years, I woke every morning believing myself the luckiest man alive, certain that nothing could shift the ground beneath us. I couldn't imagine Lila ever asking for space, because she once clung to me as if I were her anchor, the one place she could always return to when the world felt too uncertain. Yet that certainty, That sense of security would prove to be the very thing she began to resent. And though I didn't see it then, the seeds of our unraveling were already being planted, even as we stood beneath that wedding arch, promising forever. To understand how everything eventually fractured, you have to first see who I was in the life I built and who Lila believed she had married. My world before the marriage started to break down was steady, almost predictable, and in many ways, I took pride in that. I worked as a high school history teacher in a modest but respected school not far from the Oregon coast. My days followed a pattern that might have seemed boring to some. Mornings spent preparing lectures and grading papers, afternoons filled with discussions about wars, revolutions, and the lessons humanity rarely seemed to learn, and evenings devoted to quiet dinners with Lila or solitary hours reading in my small study. To me, that routine wasn't dull. It was safe. It was the life I had always envisioned for myself, a rhythm that gave me purpose and grounded me. Lila, however, came into that world like a flame darting through calm air. She worked as a freelance graphic designer, which meant her hours were inconsistent, her projects unpredictable, and her creativity unbounded. She thrived on change, on novelty, on chasing sparks of inspiration wherever they appeared. While I loved the comfort of a well-worn chair and the smell of my old books, she loved the thrill of catching the first flight to a city she had never visited before. When we first came together, these differences seemed charming, almost poetic, like the universe had paired opposites to balance one another. She teased me for being a creature of habit, and I admired her fearless appetite for the unknown. In our first apartment together, a small one-bedroom on the second floor of a weathered building overlooking the Columbia River, those differences shaped our daily lives. I liked to wake early, make coffee, and sit with the newspaper, while she often slept in after working late into the night on design projects or disappearing into rabbit holes of creative experimentation. On weekends, I wanted to stay in and cook, while she suggested we try a new restaurant an hour away or drive into Portland for a live show. And for a while, those negotiations between her wild spirit and my grounded nature felt exciting. We were discovering each other in real time, bending and adapting, making space for the other's quirks and rhythms. What made it work in those early days was the unspoken belief that we were building something together, that her creativity and my stability were not opposites, but complements. She would tell me often, sometimes as she worked with her laptop perched precariously on our kitchen counter, "Adrian, you're my calm in the storm. I don't think I'd survive without your steadiness." And I, in turn, would tell her how she kept me from becoming stagnant, how she made life feel more vibrant than I had ever imagined. In those moments, it felt like we were two halves of a whole, covering for each other's weaknesses, celebrating each other's strengths. When we finally decided to buy a house, it was a turning point. The home was a two-story craftsman with creaky hardwood floors and a backyard where I planted tomatoes, basil, and peppers each spring. For me, it was the fulfillment of a lifelong dream. A stable foundation, a place to plant roots and build a family. For Lila, I believe it was both a promise and a compromise. She loved the house's charm, the light that poured into the upstairs studio where she could set up her design work, but I think part of her already worried that the permanence of it all might suffocate her. I was too blinded by joy to see that fear flickering behind her smile. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. At this stage in our marriage, our roles were clear. I was the provider of structure, the one who made sure bills were paid, the house stayed in order, and responsibilities were met. She was the dreamer, the artist who filled our walls with her illustrations and our evenings with ideas for new adventures. Our friends often commented on how different we were, sometimes joking that they couldn't imagine two people less alike. But when they said it, I took it as a compliment. I thought it meant we had something rare, something that could withstand anything, because we balanced each other so well. Looking back, I realize how much of myself I invested into keeping that balance steady. I took on more practical responsibilities so she could pursue her art freely. I agreed to spontaneous trips even when it disrupted my work schedule, because I wanted to show her that I could bend too. I tried to learn her world, buying her design magazines and even sitting through tutorials about programs I didn't fully understand, simply so I could talk to her about the things she loved. But in doing so, I wonder if I started erasing parts of myself without realizing it. My own needs, my own desires, my own sense of what made me feel alive began to dim quietly in the background. At the time, though, I didn't notice. All I saw was the picture we were painting together. A life that seemed, at least from the outside, enviable. We had our inside jokes, our cozy evenings, our shared dreams of traveling more once we had the money saved up. I believed we were building something unshakable, and even when her restlessness poked through, when she would sigh at the idea of another quiet dinner at home or complain about how predictable our weekends felt, I thought it was just a quirk, a momentary longing, nothing serious. That was my normal, a man who believed love meant creating stability, and a woman who believed love meant never losing freedom. At first, those two ideas danced together beautifully. But, beneath the surface, the tension between them was already beginning to hum, waiting for the day it would grow too loud to ignore. If I close my eyes, I can still return to that bookstore where it all began, to the moment when my ordinary life collided with Lila's whirlwind energy. I remember the faint bell that chimed above the door as she walked in, the way her scarf caught a stray gust of wind and fluttered dramatically around her shoulders, as though even the air wanted to announce her arrival. I had gone there out of habit, a place I visited every other Saturday to browse used novels and history texts, but that day the universe seemed to have other plans. She moved through the aisles with purpose, scanning the shelves like a hunter on a mission, until she stopped in the travel section. I noticed her biting her lip as she flipped through a Spanish guidebook, muttering something under her breath about never understanding the difference between por and para. It made me smile, and before I knew it, I spoke, my voice breaking the silence of the aisle. That's the part everyone struggles with. She looked up, startled at first, then grinned, as if I had been invited into her private joke. That brief exchange sparked a conversation that lasted nearly an hour, standing right there among stacks of dusty books. She told me she had always dreamed of traveling the world, but never felt like she had the stability or resources to make it happen. I told her I had rarely left Oregon, content in the familiar rhythms of my small town. Instead of finding that difference discouraging, she laughed and said, "Perfect. I'll show you the world, and you'll remind me there's value in staying grounded." It was the kind of line you expect to hear in a movie, but when she said it, it felt real, and something inside me shifted. We left the bookstore together that day, stopping at a small cafe down the street where we continued our conversation over coffee. She ordered something complicated, a caramel macchiato with almond milk, while I stuck to plain black. That difference became symbolic of us. The way she leaned toward sweetness, complexity, and flair, and the way I leaned towards simplicity, tradition, and function. Yet sitting across from her, listening to her animated stories about art school, failed experiments in painting, and her dream to design murals in foreign cities, I felt alive in a way I hadn't in years. It wasn't just attraction, it was the sense that I had stumbled into a story bigger than myself, one I didn't want to stop reading. The weeks that followed unfolded like a blur of firsts. She invited me to an open mic poetry night, something I never would have attended on my own, and I found myself clapping along with strangers, captivated not by the performers, but by the way she snapped her fingers enthusiastically after each piece, eyes sparkling. I took her hiking along a trail I had walked dozens of times alone, and she marveled at the moss-covered trees as if she had stepped into another world, making me see my familiar landscape with fresh eyes. Every experience with her turned into something heightened, more vivid, like life itself had been turned up a notch. It didn't take long before we were inseparable. She would show up at my apartment late at night with takeout containers of Thai food, insisting we have a midnight picnic on the floor. I would leave her small notes tucked into her sketchbook, little reminders that she wasn't drifting alone anymore. My friends noticed the change in me, how I smiled more, how I seemed lighter, as if the weight I always carried had been lifted, and truthfully, it had. Being with Lila felt like being given permission to step outside the rigid boundaries I had always drawn around myself. When we officially became a couple, it wasn't marked by some grand declaration but by the simple, natural rhythm of our days. She left her toothbrush in my bathroom one night, and from then on it stayed. She began sketching at my kitchen table while I graded papers, and soon her pencils and markers were scattered among my stacks of essays. My world and hers blended seamlessly, And though our differences were still obvious, they didn't feel like obstacles. They felt like the very thing binding us together. There were early warning signs even then, though I didn't recognize them for what they were. She would joke about how I liked things too structured, teasing me for planning dinner a week in advance or insisting on sticking to the same route during our walks. I would laugh it off, thinking it was just playful banter. Likewise, I noticed how she sometimes seemed restless after a few quiet nights in, her eyes scanning her phone for events, shows, or adventures that would pull her away from the stillness I offered. I chalked it up to personality differences, believing love was enough to smooth out those edges. Our first trip together was a turning point for me. She convinced me to fly with her to New Orleans, a city bursting with noise, music, and color. I was nervous. Airports overwhelmed me, and I preferred road trips where I could control the pace. But I agreed because I wanted to prove to her, and maybe to myself, that I could step outside of my comfort zone. The trip was chaotic, filled with spontaneous detours, late-night jazz clubs, and meals eaten at odd hours, yet I found myself enjoying it more than I expected. Watching her dance in the streets to the sound of brass bands, unafraid of judgment or schedule, I felt a swell of admiration. She wasn't just living, she was thriving, and I wanted to be the one standing beside her as she did. Looking back now, those early days were marked by a kind of blind optimism. I believed that what we had discovered in each other was rare enough to withstand any differences that might arise. I mistook excitement for sustainability, passion for permanence. But in the haze of falling in love, it's easy to confuse what feels good in the moment with what will last a lifetime. At the time, though, I didn't care about the future. I was simply a man in love, holding on to the woman who made life brighter, believing wholeheartedly that brightness would never fade. The years that followed our beginning became what I now think of as the golden period, the stretch of time when life with Lila felt like everything I had ever dreamed a marriage could be. If part 3 was the spark that ignited us, then this chapter was the fire glowing steadily, warming everything in its path. It was the stage where we were not only in love, but building a life that seemed destined to flourish, and during those years, I truly believed we had found something indestructible. We moved into our first real home together a year after the wedding, a craftsman-style house painted pale blue with white trim, its porch wrapped in vines of climbing roses that bloomed every spring. For me, it was more than just a house. It was the foundation I had always wanted, a place where stability and permanence lived in every corner. For Lila, it was a canvas. She painted the walls in bold, unconventional colors, sketched murals on our back fence, and filled the rooms with her art. Where I saw beams and bricks, she saw possibility, and together we made it our own. The house became a reflection of our marriage, my steady structure holding up her free-spirited creativity. Our days settled into a rhythm that, at the time, felt perfect. I would head off to the high school where I taught, returning each evening to the smell of paint, the sound of her music drifting through the house, or sometimes the quiet click of her keyboard as she worked late on a design project. She would greet me with a hug, sometimes messy with streaks of paint on her arms, and I would tease her about decorating herself as much as her canvas. We cooked dinner together most nights, laughing as we tried new recipes she pulled from blogs or cookbooks. On weekends, we took turns choosing activities. One Saturday might be her idea, a spontaneous trip to the coast where we dipped our toes in icy waves and collected driftwood. And the next might be mine, a quiet evening with friends or simply sitting in our backyard under the stars with mugs of tea. The small moments were where I felt our love most deeply. She would fall asleep, curled against me, her head tucked into the hollow of my shoulder, and I would lie awake sometimes just listening to the rhythm of her breathing. In the mornings, she often left little sketches or doodles on scraps of paper for me to find, a coffee cup on the counter beside them with a heart drawn in foam if she had time. Our friends saw us as the couple who had figured it out, the pair who balanced each other so naturally that we made love look easy. And for a long time, I believed that was true. Travel became one of our greatest joys together. Though I had been hesitant at first, her persistence slowly drew me out of my bubble, and soon we were taking trips at least twice a year. We strolled through the streets of Barcelona, where she marveled at Gaudi's architecture, pulling me into narrow alleyways lined with shops selling handmade goods. We rode bicycles through Amsterdam, our laughter carrying over the canals as we fumbled to keep pace with the locals. We even visited Japan, where she insisted we try karaoke, and though I was reluctant, I found myself singing badly but happily while she cheered me on. These adventures became a treasure chest of memories that I believed would bind us forever, reminders that I could step into her world just as she had stepped into mine. At home, we dreamed together. We talked about building a family, though we didn't rush it. She wanted to travel more before settling down, and I agreed, thinking there was plenty of time. We shared ideas about what we wanted our lives to look like in 10-20 years. She envisioned a studio where she could teach art classes, while I imagined myself continuing to teach history, perhaps writing a book one day. Those dreams wove together like threads in a tapestry, creating a future I thought was unshakable. Even when challenges arose, they felt manageable. Money was sometimes tight, especially with her freelance work being unpredictable. But I never resented carrying the bulk of financial responsibility. I saw it as part of my role, the steady provider ensuring that she had the freedom to create. She, in turn, supported me in quieter ways, encouraging me when work became overwhelming, listening to me vent about students or administration, and reminding me that what I did mattered. We carried each other, or at least I believed we did. Looking back, it's hard not to romanticize those years because they were genuinely filled with love, laughter, and moments of peace. There were no screaming matches, no betrayals, no glaring cracks in the foundation. If anything, the warning signs were subtle, almost invisible, buried beneath the glow of what we shared. But at the time, I couldn't see them. All I saw was the joy of waking up beside the woman I loved and the comfort of believing that joy would last a lifetime. The truth is, those good times weren't just the backdrop to what would later happen, they were the reason it hurt so much when everything began to change. Because when you've known that kind of happiness, that kind of steady companionship, the loss of it feels like more than disappointment. It feels like the ground itself has been ripped out from under you. And maybe that's why people stay longer than they should when things turn sour, because they're haunted by the memory of the good times and convinced that somehow they can return. In those days, though, I wasn't haunted. I was simply living, basking in the glow of a marriage that seemed, to me, unshakable. The laughter we shared, the adventures we chased, the quiet nights we cherished, all of it painted a picture of a love story I thought would never fade. If I had known what was coming, maybe I would have held on to those moments more fiercely, savored them more deeply. But when you believe you're living your forever, you don't think about endings. You only think about how lucky you are to have found someone worth building forever with. The first warning signs didn't arrive like a thunderclap or a storm tearing down our walls. They crept in quietly, almost invisibly, like hairline cracks in glass that only become obvious once the light hits them a certain way. At the time, I brushed them off as ordinary tensions every couple faces, not realizing those small fissures would widen into deep fractures that could no longer be ignored. If you had asked me then, I would have said our marriage was solid, unshakable. But looking back now, I can pinpoint the moments when the shift began, when the ground beneath us subtly started to tremble. It began with her restlessness. Lila had always been someone who thrived on movement and novelty, and I had admired that about her in the early days. But as the years went on, I noticed her becoming increasingly dissatisfied with the rhythms of our life. She would sigh more often during quiet evenings, her eyes wandering to her phone where she scrolled through travel blogs and social media feeds filled with people jetting off to new places. When I suggested a movie night at home, she would force a smile but often seemed distracted, as if her mind was already somewhere else. I told myself it was just her personality, that I, the man of routine, shouldn't expect her to settle as easily as I did. But the more it happened, the more I felt the distance stretching between us. One particular evening stands out. I had cooked dinner, a simple roast chicken with vegetables from our garden, something I thought would make her smile because she used to love when I cooked. She sat at the table, picking at her food absent-mindedly, her phone buzzing every few minutes with messages from friends or colleagues. I tried to start a conversation about a book I had been reading, but she nodded absently, her eyes never leaving the screen. When I finally asked if something was wrong, she shrugged and said, "Nothing. I just feel like life's slipping by, you know. Like there's so much more out there, and we're stuck in this same routine every week." It wasn't an accusation, but it hit me like one. I tried to reassure her that we could travel more, that we could plan something exciting, but the way she looked at me told me she wasn't convinced. Then came the changes in our intimacy, subtle at first, but impossible to ignore. She used to reach for me in bed, curl against me without hesitation, but gradually those moments grew rarer. She claimed she was tired, overworked, not in the mood, and I believed her, at least for a while. But even when she was lying beside me, I felt as if she were miles away, her body present, but her heart elsewhere. I tried to bridge the gap by being patient, by offering her space, but the space only seemed to grow wider. Social gatherings revealed another shift. At dinners with friends, she used to hold my hand under the table or glance at me with that mischievous sparkle in her eyes when someone told a funny story. But slowly, those gestures disappeared. She became more animated with others, laughing and leaning into conversations, while I sometimes felt like a spectator, watching her from across the room. I wasn't jealous, not exactly, but I felt sidelined, as if the intimacy we once shared had been displaced into the public sphere where everyone else could enjoy her warmth but me. There were also her absences, nights where she claimed to be working late at a coffee shop or needing time to herself. I never doubted her, not then. I trusted her implicitly, convinced that her restlessness was about personal growth, not about me. But her words during those times often echoed in my head, "I just need space." At first, I thought she meant creative space, time to think and recharge, and I respected that. But those words would come back later with a sting I could never have predicted. The warning signs weren't just about her. I noticed changes in myself, too, subtle but telling. I started holding back from sharing certain things with her, sensing her disinterest. I stopped suggesting little dates or activities when I grew tired of her dismissive responses. I told myself I was giving her what she needed, room to breathe, freedom to explore, but in reality, I was retreating. I was withdrawing to protect myself from the sting of rejection, not realizing that my silence was feeding the growing gap between us. It wasn't all bad during this time, and that's what made it so confusing. There were still days when she laughed with me, still trips where we created beautiful memories. We once drove to the mountains on a whim, hiking through trails covered in golden autumn leaves, and she kissed me so passionately at the summit that I believed we were stronger than ever. But then, just days later, she would pull away again, distant and unreachable. The oscillation between closeness and distance left me dizzy, unsure of where we stood. The first time I confided in someone about my concerns, it was my colleague Marcus, another teacher at the school. We were having lunch in the faculty lounge, and I mentioned offhandedly that Lila seemed restless lately. He looked at me carefully and said, "Sometimes people outgrow the lives they thought they wanted. Doesn't mean it's over, but it does mean you've got to pay attention." His words unsettled me. Outgrow? I couldn't imagine Lila outgrowing us. We had built too much together, hadn't we? But the seed of doubt had been planted, and it lingered in the back of my mind. At that stage, I still believed everything was fixable. I thought that with enough patience, enough reassurance, enough love, she would find her way back to the woman who once clung to me, as if I were her anchor. But what I didn't realize was that the warning signs weren't just random flickers. They were the first flames of a fire I had no idea was already burning. The warning signs that once flickered quietly soon became impossible to ignore, swelling into louder arguments, colder silences, and a tension that clung to the air like humidity before a storm. Where once there had been small cracks, now fissures spread across the foundation of our marriage, and I could feel the strain with every passing day. At first, I tried to dismiss it as temporary stress, maybe from her job, maybe from life in general, but the changes were undeniable, and they were only escalating. The fights started small, usually over trivial things. She would criticize how I folded the laundry, or I would comment on how she spent too much time on her phone during dinner. Instead of laughing it off like we might have years ago, these remarks now carried sharp edges, cutting deeper than they should have. One evening I suggested we save money for a vacation together, thinking it might bring back some spark, but she snapped that I always thought a trip could fix everything, when the problem wasn't the scenery, it was us. I remember sitting there, stunned by her bluntness, wondering when she had stopped seeing me as her partner and started viewing me as part of the problem. Her restlessness grew bolder too. Lila began spending more nights out, not just working late but meeting friends or needing to clear her head. At first, I asked polite questions, where she went, who she was with, but her answers became increasingly vague. "Just with a few people from work," she would say, waving off my concern, or, "You wouldn't know them." The evasiveness gnawed at me. I wanted to trust her, but I couldn't shake the growing suspicion that I was no longer her priority. One Saturday she left in the afternoon, claiming she needed some time alone, and didn't return until nearly midnight. When she finally walked through the door, she acted surprised that I was still awake, as if my worry was an inconvenience rather than a natural response. The emotional distance translated into physical walls, and I found myself navigating a house that once felt like home but now felt like foreign territory. Meals were eaten in silence, each of us absorbed in our own thoughts. Evenings, which had once been filled with conversation or shared shows, turned into separate retreats. Her in the bedroom scrolling on her laptop, me on the couch staring blankly at the television. I tried to bridge the gap by suggesting we talk, but the word talk seemed to set her off. "Not everything has to be a deep discussion," she would say, rolling her eyes. It was as if communication, the very thing that had once bound us, had now become a chore she wanted to avoid at all costs. One of the clearest moments that made me realize how far we had drifted happened during a family gathering at my parents' house. My mother, ever the keen observer, noticed Lila's coldness and pulled me aside in the kitchen. "Is everything all right between you two?" she asked gently. I forced a smile and assured her everything was fine, but the truth hung heavy in my chest. Lila had barely spoken to me all evening, chatting animatedly with my cousins while barely acknowledging me. On the drive home, I tried to bring it up, telling her I felt hurt by the way she ignored me. She exploded, saying I was too sensitive and always making things about myself. Her words weren't just defensive. They were cruel, designed to cut me down and silence me. I remember gripping the steering wheel tightly, fighting the urge to yell back because deep down I still wanted to believe we could find our way back to each other. But the escalation didn't stop at coldness and fights. It seeped into the very fabric of my days, into the way I woke up with a knot in my stomach, dreading what new distance or hostility might unfold. My work began to suffer. Colleagues noticed my distraction, and students asked if I was okay. I would plaster on a smile, pretending everything was fine, but the truth was that my marriage had become a battlefield where I was constantly on edge, waiting for the next blow. One night, the tension boiled over into a full-blown argument. I had asked her if she wanted to spend the weekend together, maybe go hiking like we used to. She laughed bitterly, saying, "Why do you always cling? Can't you just let me breathe?" Something inside me snapped. "Breathe?" I shot back. "All I've done is give you space, but every time I give you space, you move further away." The shouting echoed in the walls, and I hated myself for raising my voice, but the frustration that had been building for months finally erupted. Instead of softening, her face hardened. She turned away and muttered, "Maybe space is exactly what I need from this marriage." The words stung, not just for their content, but for the casual way she delivered them, like tossing a grenade and walking away before it exploded. From that moment on, I felt like I was living on borrowed time. The love we once had wasn't gone completely, but it had been buried under layers of resentment, silence, and unmet expectations. I still clung to hope, but it was a fragile hope, one that felt more like denial than faith. I caught myself replaying old memories, our first trip together, her laughter when we got caught in the rain, the way she used to squeeze my hand when she was nervous, and wondered if those moments had meant as much to her as they had to me. Because if they had, how could she so easily pull away? The escalation wasn't a single event, but a series of mounting tensions that pushed us further apart, like a tide pulling me out to sea no matter how desperately I swam back toward shore. I realized, painfully, that the love story I thought was unbreakable was unraveling thread by thread, and I was powerless to stop it. What I didn't yet know was that this was only the beginning, and the storm ahead would test me in ways I had never imagined. When you're in the middle of a storm, sometimes you can't tell just how bad it has gotten until someone outside the chaos points it out. That was exactly what started happening to me, almost as if the universe had decided I needed to stop living in the fog of denial. For months, I had convinced myself that what Lila and I were going through was just a phase, that with enough patience, enough effort, things would right themselves. But little by little, the people closest to me started noticing things I had been trying so hard to bury under excuses. The first real moment of validation came from Marcus, one of my oldest friends. We had been close since college, the kind of friend who knew your past well enough to recognize when you weren't yourself anymore. One afternoon, he invited me out for coffee, and after a few minutes of small talk, he leaned forward and asked, "Man, "Are you okay? You don't seem you." I tried brushing it off, claiming I was just tired from work, but Marcus didn't buy it. He shook his head and said, "I've seen you tired before. This isn't that. This is something else. You're carrying something heavy." His words hit me harder than I expected because I had been trying to carry it all alone, convincing myself that talking about it would make me weak or disloyal. But in that moment, I felt a crack in the wall I had built around myself. I admitted, hesitantly, that things with Lila were rough, that I didn't recognize our marriage anymore. Marcus listened, really listened, without judgment, and then said, "You deserve better than to feel like a ghost in your own relationship." It wasn't just Marcus. My sister Naomi, who lived a couple of towns away, came over one weekend and noticed the atmosphere in the house immediately. She had always been close with Lila, and the distance between them spoke volumes. At dinner, Naomi kept trying to engage her, but Lila responded with curt, distracted answers, spending more time glancing at her phone than joining the conversation. After Lila excused herself early, Naomi turned to me and asked, "What's going on? She seems checked out." I tried to defend Lila, saying she'd been under stress, but Naomi wasn't convinced. "Stress doesn't make someone shut down like that, not completely," she said softly. "I don't mean to pry, but it looks like you're the only one holding this thing together." Her words stuck with me long after she left. They weren't meant to wound, but to open my eyes to what I already knew deep down. I kept replaying the phrase, "the only one holding this thing together." That was exactly how it felt, like I was patching a boat that had more holes than I had hands. The confirmation came in smaller ways too. At work, a colleague named Irene pulled me aside after a meeting. She said I seemed distracted, like my spark was gone. "You're usually the one with energy and ideas," she told me, "but lately it feels like you're just surviving the day." I brushed it off with a forced laugh, but later, sitting alone in my office, I realized how obvious it had become. The pain and strain at home had seeped into every part of my life, and people could see it even when I thought I was hiding it well. The real turning point in this external validation came when I confided in my father. He wasn't the type to get involved in my personal life unless asked, but one evening, after I had stopped by to help him with some home repairs, he sat me down at the kitchen table. "Son," he said in that steady, measured tone of his, "I've lived long enough to know when a man is carrying something he shouldn't have to carry alone. You don't have to tell me everything, but I can see it in your eyes. You're hurting." For a moment, I almost broke down. I hadn't cried in front of my father since I was a child, but hearing him acknowledge what I had been trying to suppress for so long made the weight unbearable. I told him pieces of the truth, that Lila was distant, that I felt more like a burden than a partner, that I wasn't sure how much more I could take. He listened, didn't interrupt, and when I finished, he said something that has never left me. "Marriage is supposed to be two people carrying the load together. If she's dropped her end completely, you can't carry both sides forever. That's not love, that's slow destruction." Those words lit a spark of clarity in me. I realized that my attempts to downplay, to excuse, to justify Lila's behavior weren't helping me or our marriage. Instead, they were keeping me trapped in a cycle of self-doubt and guilt. The validation from the people around me, friends, family, colleagues, wasn't about them taking my side. It was about them holding up a mirror so I could finally see what I was trying so hard not to acknowledge. And yet, despite their words, I wasn't ready to let go. Not yet. The human heart has a strange way of clinging to hope even when logic tells you it's gone. But the voices around me planted seeds, and those seeds grew into something I couldn't ignore forever. With every conversation, every concerned look, every gentle nudge from people who cared about me, I felt the reality pressing in closer. This wasn't just a rough patch. This was a collapse. And I was standing at the edge, staring into the wreckage, still deciding if I had the strength to walk away. What I didn't know then was that soon, I wouldn't have a choice. Lila herself would make the decision unavoidable, and when she did, the last remnants of denial I clung to would finally shatter. The breaking point didn't arrive in a single explosion, but in a quiet, deliberate act that tore the last thread holding us together. I came home one Thursday evening, exhausted from another long day at work, only to find the atmosphere inside the house colder than the night air. The lights were on, but the warmth of home was gone. As I walked through the living room, my heart sank when I noticed a suitcase sitting by the front door. Not mine, not ready for a trip, but half unzipped, its contents spilling out as if someone had been rifling through it in haste. My chest tightened with dread as I followed the sound of drawers slamming upstairs. When I entered the bedroom, the scene that met me was surreal. Lila stood over my dresser, pulling out my clothes, tossing them into a pile on the bed without care or thought. My shirts were wrinkled, shoes mismatched, personal items thrown together like they were garbage. At first I froze, unable to process what I was seeing. Then the words tumbled out of my mouth before I could stop them. "What are you doing?" My voice cracked, a mixture of confusion and disbelief. She didn't even look up. Her tone was clipped, flat, rehearsed. "I need space from this marriage," she said, as if the words were an administrative announcement, not a dagger piercing my chest. "I can't do this anymore. You need to go." It was the calmness in her delivery that shattered me more than the words themselves. I stood there, watching the woman I had once sworn to love and protect, packing my life into a suitcase like it was nothing more than clutter to be cleared away. My mind spun, searching for something to say that could change her mind, some argument that could reach her heart. But the truth was written in her eyes. She was already gone. All the late nights, the excuses, the distance, they hadn't been random cracks. They had been the preparation for this very moment. For a long second, I couldn't move. My hands trembled at my sides. My throat felt raw, but then something shifted inside me. Maybe it was the accumulation of all the validation I had received from friends and family. Maybe it was the exhaustion of carrying the weight alone. But suddenly I felt a strange clarity cut through the pain. This wasn't love anymore. This wasn't a partnership. It was her decision, and in that moment, I realized I didn't have to beg her to stay or to keep fighting a war. One was already losing. So I steadied my voice and said words I never thought I would say. "Take all the space you want. Forever." She froze, her hand gripping one of my shirts mid-fold, and for the first time that evening, she looked directly at me. Her eyes flickered with something. Surprise, maybe, or annoyance, but not regret. She let the shirt fall, then crossed her arms and muttered, "Fine." That single word confirmed everything. She had been waiting for me to resist, to plead, maybe even to grovel, but when I didn't, when I gave her the freedom she claimed to want, she had nothing left to fight for. In that moment, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. A wave of grief crashed over me, but beneath it was a strange undercurrent of relief. For months, maybe years, I had been drowning in the tension, desperately treading water to keep something alive that she had already abandoned. And now, standing in that bedroom surrounded by half-packed bags and shattered promises, I finally accepted the truth. There was no going back. We were done. The rest of the evening blurred together. I didn't shout, didn't throw things, didn't beg her to reconsider. Instead, I quietly gathered what she had already started pulling from drawers, folded them neatly, and placed them into the suitcase. Each item felt like another nail in the coffin of our marriage. When the bag was zipped, I carried it downstairs myself, setting it by the door like a guest preparing to leave. The silence between us was deafening, but within it, I found a strange calm I hadn't felt in months. Later that night, I drove away from the house we had once filled with laughter and dreams, now just a shell of what used to be. As the taillights of my car cut through the darkness, I realized I was driving away not just from a house, but from years of illusions I had clung to. The final realization settled over me like a heavy blanket. I couldn't save something that wasn't mine to save anymore. She had chosen her space, her freedom, and I had chosen my dignity. That night, alone in a cheap motel room, I sat on the edge of the bed staring at the suitcase that held fragments of my life. My mind replayed the scene over and over, her voice cold, her eyes detached, her hands moving through my belongings as if erasing me from the picture. The pain was raw, slicing through me with every breath, but beneath it was a growing ember of determination. This wasn't the end of me, it was only the end of us. And though I didn't know how to start over, I knew one thing for certain. I would never again beg someone to stay who had already walked out in their heart. Rock bottom wasn't the night she packed my bags. Rock bottom was the realization that the person I had built my life with no longer saw me as part of her future. It was a brutal truth. But it was also the moment everything became clear. From here, there was only one direction left to go: forward. The night I left our home, I thought the weight of it would crush me, that I would crumble under the grief of losing everything I had fought for. But in the days that followed, a strange strength began to take root in me, a strength born not of triumph but of survival. I had made a choice, even if it felt forced upon me, and choices have a way of giving us back some control over our lives. The first morning I woke up in that motel room, I stared at the ceiling and told myself, "You're not going back. Not this time. You're not begging, you're not bargaining, you're moving forward." It became my mantra, something to repeat every time doubt tried to sneak back into my heart. Taking action wasn't easy. The practicalities alone felt overwhelming. I had to call my parents, explain what happened without collapsing into anger or self-pity. I had to find a lawyer, set up a temporary arrangement for our finances, and figure out where I would live once the motel stopped being an option. Every step felt like walking barefoot over broken glass, but with each painful stride I also felt myself reclaiming a part of who I was. I wasn't her dependent. I wasn't her project. I was a man who could take control of his own life again. The execution of this new path wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, methodical, and filled with small victories that only I could measure. Signing the rental agreement for a modest apartment, carrying my boxes up 2 flights of stairs, arranging my clothes in a closet that was mine alone. It all felt bittersweet, but empowering. There were moments of crushing loneliness, of course. Nights when I reached for a body that wasn't there. Mornings when I instinctively brewed 2 cups of coffee before realizing only one was needed. But I learned to sit with that emptiness instead of running from it. The silence that once tormented me became, in time, a kind of companion. It reminded me that I was free. One afternoon, about a month after moving into my new place, I met Marcus again for coffee. He looked me over and smirked, shaking his head. "You look different, man. Lighter," he said. And I realized he was right. The tension that had once gripped my shoulders had eased. The dark circles under my eyes were fading. I was still grieving, yes, but I was also healing. Naomi came to visit not long after, and when she stepped into my apartment she hugged me tightly and whispered, "I'm proud of you." For the first time in a long time, I believed those words. But the true shift didn't come from others. It came from within. I started rediscovering parts of myself that had been buried under the weight of a failing marriage. I picked up my old guitar, something I hadn't touched in years, and found comfort in the familiar strum of strings. I started jogging in the mornings, not just to stay active but to clear my mind, to feel my lungs fill with fresh air, a symbol of the freedom I had claimed. I even signed up for a local cooking class, where I met strangers who knew nothing of my past and saw me only as who I was in that moment. Each of these steps, small as they seemed, became bricks in the foundation of a new life. There were still hard days, of course. Days when I questioned whether I had done enough, whether I could have fought harder, held on longer. But every time those doubts surfaced, I remembered the sight of Lila's cold eyes as she packed my belongings, the sharpness of her words as she said she needed space from this marriage. That wasn't love. That wasn't partnership. Love doesn't ask you to erase yourself to make room for someone else's freedom. Real partnership is carrying the weight together, not dropping it on the shoulders of one person until they break. Looking back now, I can see the wisdom hidden inside the pain. Sometimes the people we love most are the very ones who teach us the hardest lessons. Lila taught me that holding on to someone who doesn't want to stay is the fastest way to lose yourself. She taught me that silence and indifference can wound deeper than words. But most importantly, she taught me that letting go isn't always a failure. It can be the bravest act of self-preservation. If there's one truth I carry forward from this experience, it's this: love should never be a prison. If someone asks for space, give it to them, but also give yourself the dignity of deciding whether you want to wait outside the bars of their absence or walk into the open air of your own freedom. I chose freedom. And though it came wrapped in heartbreak, it also brought me peace. To anyone listening who might be standing at the edge of the same cliff I once stood on, hear this: you are not weak for wanting more. You are not selfish for refusing to carry a load that was meant to be shared. You deserve a love that doesn't make you beg, that doesn't make you question your worth, that doesn't make you feel invisible in your own life. And if walking away is the only way to find that, then walk with your head high, because sometimes the end of one story is just the beginning of another. My story began with a suitcase and a broken declaration, "I need space from this marriage." It ended with me replying, "Take all the space you want, forever." Painful as those words were, they freed me. And in that freedom, I found the man I thought I had lost. Today, I live not in the shadow of what could have been, but in the light of what still can be. So if this story resonates with you, if you see yourself in my pain or my decisions, take a moment to reflect. And remember, sometimes the greatest gift you can give yourself is the courage to let go. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.